treating me right.
Hello and welcome to Let's Talk. I'm John Kane. I'm the host, and I'm by myself today. No Shawnee this week. She's traveling. Look, I wanted to say we completed our summer fun drive, but that doesn't mean you can't make a phone call and become a WBAI buddy, especially in the name of the show. But I got to tell you, if you call 516-620-3602 and sign up to become a buddy, if you put this show down, that's great. But you're supporting all the programs here in doing so. You're supporting the entire station. So as much as I'd love to see the number of buddies that sign up in the name of this show, just be aware that when you sign up as a buddy for this show, you're signing up as a buddy for all shows. So again, 516-620-3602. Even though we're not on Fund Drive, you can call that number anytime to become a WBAI buddy. Or you can go online. You can go to give2wbai.org. That's www.give2wbai.org, and you can follow the prompts there to become a WBAI buddy or make a donation of any size. So I just want to mention that. I also want to mention that this show becomes a podcast. We take the audio from the show and we put it up on SoundCloud, which ultimately puts it up as on all the podcast platforms. So you can catch this show either in the archives on WBAI at WBAI.org, or you can subscribe to the Let's Talk Native podcast, and then you'll get this show and the shows that I do from back home in Seneca Territory as a part of Let's Talk Native. But we include these shows in there as well. I also, since we stream video of the show on Facebook Live, I take that video and I put it up on my YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. So you can subscribe to that channel as well. You can catch. Look, not everybody does the Facebook thing, and I get that, and there are many reasons to be concerned about a company the size of Facebook. But if you're looking for other types of social media to follow shows on, there are podcasts. You can go to YouTube and become subscribed to Let's Talk Native TV, and you can catch the show that way as well. So I wanted to get that stuff explained to some extent. Now, I am not completely alone because I do have joining me by telephone my good friend Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. So, Roxanne's been on the show a number of times, so I don't need to probably do too long an introduction. But let me just say, the three books that we have had her on the show specifically promoting, and three of her latest books are quite notable, as are her previous books. But one of the books that is really becoming a standard in terms of education is An Indigenous People's History of the United States. Her book that she collaborated with Dina Gilio-Whitaker, who was on my show last week, All the Real Indians Died Off and 20 Other Myths About Native Americans, is also a very good and easy read to pick out some very specific just mistruths, mischaracterizations about Native people. And her latest book, which is something we're going to talk quite a bit about today, is Loaded: A Disarming History of the Second Amendment. So again, I want to welcome back to the show Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Roxanne, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, John. And by the way, the young people's edition of An Indigenous People's History of the United States just came out a couple of weeks ago.
Well, that's awesome, and I know that that's been an audio book. I have both the text version and the audio version, so I know there's any number of ways that people can experience a lot of the research that went into kind of the Howard Zinn style of telling some truth about history. And so again, I know I greatly appreciate that, and that book has been almost a game changer for a lot of people, because one of the things that I've always heard is that where are there books that I can read about this stuff? And so now you have almost a one-stop shopping resource that people can gain a tremendous amount of information, and that, especially in collaboration with your book with Dina, ends up giving some pretty good information that kind of cuts to the chase on a lot of these issues.
Yeah, and Loaded is really an important part of that. It was actually one paragraph in the Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States that an editor, her City Lights books, published it, asked me, sent me that paragraph, which is in the chapter on the Constitution of the Covenant, and it was on the Second Amendment, and said, could you write a book, expand this to a book? And I had never thought of that, even though I knew, I said yes, and I can do that quickly because it's all, it's in my mind, but I had never thought to write about it because I get so exasperated with all the arguments, about gun control and gun violence and the mass shootings and everything.
And gun rights. I mean, one of the things that's so confusing about the Second Amendment is, for one thing, it's not really good English in the first place. It's kind of an insubordinate clause, but the way it's framed, and it makes it again, it pitches it as if it's about making sure that because they didn't have a standing army, that they had a well-armed and a well-regulated militia, citizen militia, that could be called upon in any time where they were being oppressed or facing the tyranny, not just of King George or whoever, but that's the way it's framed. But when in your book you go much farther than that. You say this isn't even so much about this idea of having an armed, well-regulated militia. This was specifically about putting guns in the hands of colonists for one and basically two purposes. One is to deal with hostile native people that they were in a constant effort to take land from, and that's why native people were hostile. And of course, ultimately, to keep a large number of black slaves and native slaves in check, and making sure they could maintain control over an absolutely oppressed people.
Yeah, and this thing about first of all the fallacy of a lack of a standing army. They had just fought 10 years of war against the United States and won, and it was actually one of the largest armies in the world at the time. One of the most effective and largest armies in the world was founded in the United States,
mm-hmm.
and it was codified in the Constitution as the Army, and also state militias, which became National Guard, are also codified in the Constitution in Article 8. So it makes no sense to think that the Second Amendment refers to either of those things. It refers to what already existed in the colonies of settler militias, self-organized, very well regulated among themselves. In other words, not roving bands of robbers or thieves, highwaymen, but self-organized for a purpose, to kill Indians and take land. And that's literally how the West was won, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, being the West, all of it.
Well, and at the time, when you're talking about that era of time, there wasn't a whole lot of conversation about, specifically about white supremacy. It was a foregone conclusion amongst the colonists that they were a superior being, that anybody else, native, black, and any other people of color were an inferior people. So it was like it wasn't even a debate. And so the idea that you would arm specifically white people to make sure that you could keep a lesser human being in check was really what the Second Amendment and the efforts of the Founding Fathers was really about.
Yeah, and it was, it already existed from day one, 1607, when John Smith came to, with the settlers in Jamestown and organized the first settler militia, and John Mason in 1620 in New England, and they were mercenaries, both of them, lifetime mercenary soldiers. John Smith had just been fighting in Turkey, fighting the Muslims
mm-hmm.
for Britain, but as a this kind of counterinsurgency that had already been invented for colonial violence. And so they formed the first settler militias. And so from day one, these settler militias were active. So all the Constitution did with the Second Amendment is reaffirm, their existence. And it was kind of tacked on because it was taken so for granted that they existed.
Mm-hmm.
sort of came up, well, let's put this in, but they really didn't debate it. There was no opposition to it. It was maybe how to word it. And it was probably good English for them at that time because they knew what they meant by it. And it's so obvious from the historical context. And that's what people strip away. And then they invent, this usual U.S. narrative history that the thing about these white settlers in North America is never once, and to this day, that group of people, the armed white nationalists, now the whole Republican Party as well, they never once object to what the federal government does, except when it puts any restriction on them to do exactly what they want to do, and then they get upset, if they're taxed or if they're. So it doesn't really come from that English tradition of that's often said, of anti-royalists. It's an invention in a settler colony.
Well, and I think one of the things that I think that again, looking at this historically, in any one of these imperialistic countries of Europe that went into, whether it was Africa or India or other parts of Asia or in the Western Hemisphere, the main purpose for weaponizing themselves was to weaponize themselves against the insurgency, to arm themselves against the population that they were attempting to either eliminate or remove.
Yeah, and they couldn't. It's not that they did have a standing army, but armies can't do what irregular, counterinsurgents can do on the ground. There's no way, an army can come in, could ever come in and do the kind of, first of all, people who go through army training often, as the mid-19th century anyway, there were rules of war, and they created the prisoner of war. The United States was party to those, and it had been practiced even before in the art, in the covenants around war in Europe. So there were certain restrictions built into army training that you don't kill an unarmed person. You don't burn their villages. You don't burn their fields. Armies are not supposed to do that. And
women and children.
They're going rogue if they did. Like in Vietnam, they're going rogue. So they had special forces there that could do that because they're trained to do that. That's what John F. Kennedy invented in 1960. He sort of brought back that that kind of counterinsurgency that they were allowed to do. So that's the thing that they could call the army in. This and the colonial armies, colonial militias, the state militias as well, like the Bacon Rebellion, so beloved by liberal historians because they think, oh, here's black and white people fighting on the same side, against the colonial people. But of course, Nathaniel Bacon was an aristocrat, and but he wanted more land. And the colony, Virginia colony, had limited any further expansion because they had so much pushback from the native people that they were losing, they
well, and that's one of the things that's the reason I had you join me on the 4th of July, because one of the things that is not ever really talked about much is the influence that the desire for more native lands played in the rebellion against Great Britain, and I make the argument that two of the main reasons that the aristocratic colonists wanted independence from Great Britain was a growing frowning upon slavery and the limitation that the king was trying to put on expansion in the native territories. Everybody likes to talk about taxation without representation and this whole train of abuses that they claim that the king was responsible for. But the biggest thing that they were concerned about was being able to hang on to their free labor and to have access to more free land.
Yeah, and the 1763 proclamation by the British that they couldn't go any further west. That's when they rebelled. That's what they rebelled.
And see, nobody, just like you still have people that want to argue whether the Civil War was really about slavery. Nobody even has this discussion to suggest that the War of Independence had more to do with the fact that the colonists were frankly pissed at the king for limiting their expansion into farther into Indian country, which was, and it wasn't because the king wasn't ultimately hoping to peacefully subjugate native people under the crown, but he certainly did not want to. Well, for one thing, he had a certain indebtedness that he claimed he wanted to represent with his proclamation, because the Six Nations and other native peoples had assisted Great Britain so much against the French. But there was also an expenditure issue, and even the taxation without representation thing. You mentioned when you joined me last that much of the taxes that was being assessed on the colonies was for their own protection and to try to maintain peace along those frontier boundaries.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was for. The Stamp Act was imposed upon the colonies to pay for that, that implementation of the proclamation.
Mm-hmm.
George Washington, from 1822, when he was like, a young man, he was already, and others, in pushing that frontier, and then surveying and drawing up plots of land and pieces of paper of real estate and selling that to white settlers. And then they were going in, and this became very intense with, most famously with Daniel Boone leading people in. They were going in illegally, but they had papers that they owned that land. So they had made huge amounts of money off selling land that was just on paper, because they neither controlled it nor, and they didn't happen to tell the native people, hey, we've sold your land already.
Well, and George Washington himself was quite guilty of that, not only as an early land speculator and surveyor, but as a general and ultimately the president. He was paying people off with tracts of land that they had clearly not secured.
Absolutely, hadn't been taken yet, and as they had lost the war, it was all that land was beyond the proclamation.
Sure. Well, and part of the reason I even wanted to have this conversation, obviously, we're having this conversation in the wake of some of a series of additional deadly shootings that take place, and of course, primarily the culprits in these mass shootings are white people standing very, very strongly on their Second Amendment rights. I mean, making that the argument, and also, spewing some of the same rhetoric that comes from the President of the United States, and some of the same rhetoric that has some historical context. So, I mean, frankly, when I hear somebody say, well, this idea of bigotry and racism and violence against people of color is not the America that I grew up in. That's not the America I know. And it's funny, as a Native person, it's exactly the America that I know.
Exactly. Yeah, it's this imaginary America that is really mythical. That's actually believed in by people who, I don't know, who are white, usually, for one thing, but also are have enough wealth and protection and a bubble that they live in, a liberal bubble, where they think that's how the United States is within their bubble. So this is largely suburban people who do still live in this kind of bubble. And it's the only, it's in San Francisco where I live. It's one of those bubbles.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing, I mean, the other thing that is related to that is this notion that that anybody who enlists in the armed services is defending the freedoms and the Constitution of the United States. And and every time I hear somebody who tries to shoot back at somebody who criticizes either the flag or or military service, they say, well, I have my uncle died to protect your right to say the things that you're saying, and there's no evidence that anybody, especially who goes into a foreign land, who is involved in one of these military engagements that the United States is in a constant battle with, is doing anything to support free speech or the right of assembly or freedoms of any kind. And in fact, while a soldier may take an oath to defend the U.S. Constitution, whether they do that or not is a question. They certainly aren't taking an oath to follow the Constitution. In fact, they talk about everything from border patrols in this 100-mile barrier that is a Constitution-free zone where elements of the Constitution can be suspended in the interest of securing the United States. And the same thing is said, with this military. So I have a big problem. And in fact, Native people who enlist at a very high rate into the military, for me, I speak out against it. I just think it's wrong for people to encourage their children to enlist in a military that is not advancing freedom in any way, shape, or form.
No, unfortunately, there are many vets who come back. The Veterans for Peace and the Iraq Vets Against the War and Afghanistan as well, who testify to this and really organize. And I think they see through it like no one else does. But they're very few, they're a very small percentage, but they're everywhere all the time. And I really appreciate them so much because there is this thing in the United States that there's a huge credibility that goes with having served in the military. And I think it's gotten more intense in the last few years than I remember it earlier, in my life, because of course the Vietnam War was not a very honorable war, but they've rebuilt that kind of World War II or whatever this sense of the
romanticizing it all, really, yeah.
It's really, I just wince every time I go to board an airplane and they say that soldiers in uniform, have priority. I say, why? Why? They're getting paid.
Well, you can't go into a coffee shop and not have somebody ask you if you're a veteran, or a Home Depot or any of these. I mean, it's like, they place such a high priority. And look, and I'm not necessarily condemning somebody who, for whatever their circumstances are, puts them in a position where they think enlisting in the armed forces is the best option that they have, because there's a lot of reasons that happens that have more to do with social problems back home than anything else. But at the same time, if you continue to romanticize this thing, you never give anybody the real opportunity to scrutinize and question this whole idea, because you can't disconnect this romanticizing of war and military from this Second Amendment stuff to the some of this white supremacy stuff, and frankly, when it comes right down to these mass killings.
I don't know if you've heard this guy called Mayor Pete, who's one of the candidates for president.
Yeah.
He's mayor of Notre Dame.
Buttigieg or something like that.
South End. But he keeps saying he's very much for gun control. He was saying these are weapons that I use in the military, and you know what they're for. And he describes in great gory detail how they're meant to tear the body apart. And he says, but that's the Army, and that's the enemy. And I said, you're killing mostly civilians with those weapons. How dare you?
Yeah, because even then, even when they try to do that, they still want to justify that, and the fact that there is so much collateral damage, and from not only these, I have a big problem with that.
maybe slightly off, not mentally ill, but, really on the edge of resentment and, economic problems and all of these things, they see that as, as some kind of power they can exert. And what is that? What is different between that and, the U.S. soldiers destroying peasant villages in Afghanistan, Iraq, and before that, Vietnam? So I think the militarization, this is also the other missing component, is that Second Amendment was very much attached to the militarization of the continent as well. Mm-hmm. And it's the only thing, the Second Amendment is the only thing that distinguishes the United States from other countries with all these statistics of the number of weapons. When I wrote my book 2 years ago, it was published a year and a half ago, the count was 300 million but now they're saying 392 is what I read. So either, the statistics were off 2 years ago, or that's a huge increase in the number of weapons. But I know, they don't really know because so many are in private hands. And 20% of gun sales are in people's homes,
right.
Between individuals.
And even a lot of the gun show stuff doesn't even. A lot of the gun show stuff doesn't even report.
Yeah, out of the trunk of the car and out of the roving gun, people with guns individually, and there's actually no laws against that at all, as long as it's not a licensed dealer.
Yeah, yeah.
So I don't know how many guns there are, but there's no country in the world that even comes close. Not even Yemen, that's in the midst of bloody warfare. They're second to us in guns and
per capita.
Civilians.
Yeah.
So the only thing that distinguishes the Second Amendment, and the Second Amendment is it has to be dealt with because it is an empowerment of gun ownership. And it's also, I hear even a lot of liberals, guys mostly white, saying, well, I think I'll get a gun. It's this right I have, and I'm not using this right as if, you have to use it.
Well, and that's right. I mean, there's so many on the left, that Democrats and liberals in general, that are so afraid to really take on the Second Amendment. I mean, in fact, they all will frame any conversation about guns about protecting the Second Amendment. That's almost at its core. And of course, on the female side of this thing, because keep in mind that many of the women who enter into politics are oftentimes veterans. And so they have a certain amount of almost this like they feel like to be in that world, they've got to, it's like it's a man's world and they've got to somehow masculate themselves a little bit to be there, which to me is almost counter to the whole idea. I think the idea of women being in these positions, I don't want them to be man-like. I want them to. The characteristics of a woman are exactly what we do need in some of these positions. Not somebody who's going there to tout their top cop attitude or their military background or any of that other stuff.
Yeah, I like Tulsi Gabbard's opposition to the war. And she doesn't brag that much about being in the service. But John, my alarm just went off. I have to go.
Well, I thank you so much. This is what I was hoping for, was to get a good half hour with you, and I certainly do appreciate it. Thank you so much for being a part of my show, and I look forward to having you back, especially when you're in the city.
Yes, definitely.
All right, well, you take care of yourself, and that's Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. She's the author of An Indigenous People's History of the United States, All the Real Indians Have Died Off, and 20 Other Myths About Native Americans, and her latest book, and the one that we spoke from primarily about, which is Loaded, A Disarming History of the Second Amendment. That is Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who I greatly appreciate having joined us. We're going to take a break here with about an hour. We'll take a break, and we'll come back with your calls at 212-209-2877, 212-209-2877. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk.
so calm to me. Love in the world is come so naturally. It's a gift from my mother, can't deny. The day we lose it is the day, that's the day we die. No more senseless death, it should have never been. No more senseless death, drinking water that's not clean. It should be right, all humanity, to partly water, not for money, not for greed. What have we done? Put poison in the heart. What have we done to our children's future? This madness has gotta stop. This madness.
All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane, and this is Let's Talk. Hey, I would remind people, I would love to, sign a buddy up with each show that we do, even when we're not in Fund Drive, maybe a couple. So if you want to become a WBAI buddy, especially in the name of the show, give a call. Call 516-620-3602. Mention Let's Talk with John Kane as the show that you are becoming a buddy on behalf of. And, of course, you benefit all of our shows, and you benefit the station in doing so. And, of course, as been described, there are other perks that come along with it, tote bag, membership, all kinds of other things. So please do become a buddy to the to WBAI buddy and a buddy to the show by calling 516-620-3602, or you can go online to www.give the number 2 WBAI.org. That's give2wbai.org. All right, we're going to go to your calls, and the number to call in is 212-209-2877. I know I'm giving an awful lot of numbers, aren't I? Okay, well, this is the number to call. This is the number to be a part of this show. That's 212-209-2877. That's the number to call to be a part of the show. We got one. We got one on the line already. So we'll usually here's the way it works. First off, you got to make sure your phone, your radio's turned down. And I usually ask, just as a courtesy, your first name and where you're calling from. This isn't because I'm trying to. I'm not coming to find you later. This is just a courtesy. So if you want to decline to give a name or a location, that's fine too. But caller, you're first. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hey, John Kane. This is Charlie from Roslyn.
Hey, Charlie. How you doing?
You want to come over and visit me? Fine. Listen. I'm surprised you're not catching on, or you're not bringing out the fact of what's going on today. I mean, you were talking about with that guest about how the white people went over to the native lands and took it over, especially with the new system of capitalism, which enabled them to really take it over. But I just came back from Amsterdam. I was in Amsterdam for a week, and I'll tell you what's going on over there. I didn't see too many Dutch people. What I saw, 99% of the people, not 99%, but a whole lot of people of color coming up from the South. And that's basically what's going on with globalization. I mean, the South is coming up to the northern capitalist countries, which I think is going to be a good thing, okay, because there's benefits to capitalism. Not that white people are superior, but the system is superior. Okay, that's the point I'm always making with you.
Yeah, no, I get it. I get it.
In fact, I spoke to a Dutch man. I wanted to get people's opinions, so I'm over there talking, and everybody speaks English because Dutch is very close to English. And I got this middle-aged guy, and I'm Italian American. And from what I understand, I'm not a scholar on history and stuff. What I understand is capitalism was born basically in Florence, for various reasons. One of the reasons was the monarchies over there were very weak, and they couldn't crush the commerce that was going on. But I found this middle-aged Dutch guy, and he speaks English fine, and I'm kind of embarrassed that I don't speak their language. We got to start learning languages here in America. So I said to him, all this over here, this really came up from Florence 500 years ago. So he says in his Dutch accent, if I was an Italian, I would say that, and that blew me away. That's like a psychopathic comment, So basically he's saying that you should only fight for your nationality and just disregard truth and historical fact. Okay, so I was friendly with him, and I said, no. This all arose in the Italian Renaissance in Florence, basically. The Renaissance happened in Italy way before, and the bourgeoisie arose over there before Northern Europe, and it evolved northward, independent of man's will. So, I'm talking to him and stuff, and, we're arguing a little bit, in a very friendly argument, and he starts talking about the stocks. And I just found out later, I have a friend who knows about this stuff, that the Medici family in Florence, or wherever they were in Italy, they developed bonds, which is the beginnings of stocks. So he's saying, well, we have stocks, and you didn't have the stocks, and whatever. So I start saying, well, the seeds of this modern world was started in Florence. He starts catching on, and he kind of skedaddles out of there. He's understanding he's having an argument with this guy over here, and but it was very friendly. But I was left standing. And he had to agree that basically he got this from the South, even though we don't think of Italy as from the South. This system arose in the South, the modern world. If you want to, in Italy.
Yeah, and the problem that I have is though, and I know you call in often, and with this kind of the same position that capitalism, was a better system than feudalism, and that capitalism somehow played a role in ending slavery. Which it absolutely did not. I mean, slavery was used to advance capitalism, especially by the aristocracies, not only of Europe, but also the aristocracies that developed out of the United States and all of the colonial empires.
Slavery, capitalism.
No,
that was the transition period.
I mean, just because you want to say that capitalism is all about equality and market freedom, and it absolutely is not. It is absolute. No. Let me finish. There is no question that the aristocracy, especially of the American colonies, not only depended on the theft of resources and land from indigenous people, but depended on advancing their wealth in a capitalist system by having free labor. And this is one of the areas where I think your argument about capitalism being this gem kind of falls a little flat. And I don't necessarily agree with the position that you take that capitalism ended in an era of medieval oppression.
Well, let me explain myself. I'm not saying capitalism is in any means a perfect system. I'm agreeing with Marx on this. Karl Marx saw capitalism as a better system than the feudalistic system that was a replacement. It was a notch better. It did eradicate slavery. You don't see any slaves today.
Well,
you see a lot of injustice today. You see classism today. You see some racism. Yes, you do. It's not a perfect system by any means.
Capitalism expanded slavery, and it turned slavery into a capitalistic enterprise.
Why did we have the war? We had the war.
Which war?
Civil War. The Civil War in this country was the war against the industrialized North, against the feudalistic slave
and the War of
South.
Independence against Great Britain was to defend slavery and to defend the theft of land. So,
but that wasn't capitalism yet.
Yeah, sure it was. It absolutely was. You don't think Columbus was a capitalist?
You're making me defend capitalism.
Yeah.
I don't like this.
Yeah.
I don't like defending capitalism.
Well, you seem to do it with every program. All right, look, I want to go to a few other callers. Thank you for your call, Charlie. It's always great to engage you. So I appreciate the call. All right, caller, you're up next. What's your name and where are you calling from? Caller?
Hi, it's Thomas. Hello?
Yes, there you are.
Hi, Thomasina from Bergen County.
Hi, Thomasina. Thanks for calling.
Hi. I'm actually was prompted to call because of your previous caller. He calls into every show I listen to and espouses this nonsense. So I really wish you would hang up on him from now on because he just likes to hear himself talk, like him talking about the conversation with the guy in Amsterdam. Is he kidding me? That is the most boring thing I've ever heard.
Yeah,
So,
and
I
he never really got to his point about there being such a presence of people of color in Amsterdam either. So I don't fully understand that. But you're right. I probably let him go on a little bit too long. But but I try to be courteous with the caller. So so there's that.
Understand. Yeah, I understand you're being courteous. That's why I called up to say what a creep he is, and I don't like when he calls in. So I wanted him to hear that from me. You know what I'm saying?
All right.
So my point is, like, I had professors like this when I was, I'm a history teacher, and just so you know, I make sure I teach Columbus as the most horrible person in the world as he was.
Mm-hmm.
And I make sure I tell the truth about, capitalism and how it, pervaded every sense of any humanity that we ever had. I mean, this guy's kidding me.
Yeah, reduces everything down to $1, everything down to $1. Yeah, I mean, how does that elevate people?
Yeah, it's like, and making money at any expense possible. I mean, is he kidding me? This guy is like the true capitalist in his views.
Yeah, no, I
agree. So and he's historically incorrect to say, like, I'm glad you corrected him, that to say that capitalism stopped slavery? Is he not? Like, we're celebrating, hundreds of years of slavery, not celebrating, but we're memorializing hundreds of years of slavery in the United States, this month, I believe.
Well, and we could argue that slavery still exists when you think about the how many people work and still live beneath the poverty line. I mean, we could argue.
Oh, yeah, that's wage slavery. But we, not even to get into semantics, even if we just went up to the period of the Civil War. I mean, is he kidding me? Like, the amount of cotton that was produced as a result of the cotton gin. I mean, Eli Whitney was horrified. He thought it was going to make slavery better, and it just increased production. Like, he had no idea it was going to go in that direction. So, I mean,
well, and so much of the national wealth of the United States is still born out of some of the revenue, frankly, the political system, the electoral college. There's so many things that are flawed in the United States that are still tied directly to that slave era. And I have to remind people that slaves weren't just imported from Africa. I mean, the first slaves were native people who were bounded to slavery as well. And I think sometimes I think it's important to remind people of that.
Yeah, it's 100%. And so, like, so as a history teacher, I just wanted to let you know, because a couple of times I've been listening to the program, and I understand that there's real issues with how, Native history is being taught or indigenous history is being taught. I just want you to know, from me, my perspective, I am trying so hard to make sure that I am presenting the true facts about what our country did to the Native people of this continent. So I just want you to know, I always start at the top. Like, I start with the water lady and how the Navajo don't even have any, like, real running water on the reservations right now. And I start from there, and then I go back into history.
Well, I sure do appreciate it, and I appreciate the call. All right, we'll go to another caller. Caller, you're up next. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hey, halito. Hey, my name's Hiloha Homa, Red Thunder, I'm Choctaw. I'm kind of celebrating because this is the first time I've been able to get through.
Well, I'm celebrating with you then. Thank you very much for calling.
Yeah, and I left a little blurb on the Facebook page for Let's Talk too about because I was listening earlier. You were, I think it was the show from the 10th. We were saying it was your anniversary.
Right.
And I left a little notation that's actually a significant day for me.
I saw that note. Thanks for that. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, Pope and other relatives is, one of my heroes. I feel, pretty blessed. I grew up around the, Los Angeles Indian community, from a kid,
Mm-hmm.
I tell people, Los Angeles has probably the largest population of Indian people. I'm laughing because it's like people want to go, what? Well.
No, people have no idea. I mean, even here in New York City, at any given time, there's 100,000 Native people who live here. That doesn't seem like much compared to 10 million people in the outlying areas, but it's still a significant population.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I won't take up too much time as my way. I think that we need to remind ourselves sometimes that, others want to speak too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
This happens in our lodges too and stuff. A lot of times I'm real quiet and they say, well, you're awful quiet in lodge. Well, yeah, there's like one too many Buffalo speeches, and I just kind of like, I opt out, and hey, so I just want to say, quick, a lot of things you've been talking about are really pretty close to my responsibility, or if not exactly my responsibility. I grew up and was fortunate enough to be with our elders out here from a lot of places, and even Orrin, Orrin was out here too, along with a lot of other people. Hollywood seems to like attract everybody.
Yeah, it sure does.
but one of the most significant experiences I had, as a young man was being able to spend time with one of our relatives, and he was Lakota, Hong Papa, named Robert Sundance. And I don't know if that name rings a bell with anyone, but
no, it doesn't. Not with me, anyway.
He was the executive director of the American Indian Alcoholism Commission in California, and he was also a legal treaty rights expert. So I used to assist him, and then a couple other elders. And the main thing he would talk about back in early '90s was the doctrine of discovery, and we did Indian rights violations testimonials. We had one at Cal State LA, and we'd have other places, and we had our various Native groups in Los Angeles, and he was kind of like a center, well of knowledge for us. And I didn't really start hearing other people talk about the doctrine of discovery until like maybe the 2000s and stuff like that. And it's like, I have old paperwork that he dispensed about it, and one of his main endeavors was figuring out how the United States court system wrested plenary power of our people, our nations, from our tribes. And he pretty much nailed it. This is sort of like the centerpiece of like most of our ills is that document.
Well, and they did it with Marshall's trilogy of cases from Cherokee. That's the start of it, which includes the codification of the doctrine of Christian discovery into U.S. law through Johnson v. McIntosh. But that's where they created this myth that somehow Congress was bestowed, and that it was the intention of the founding fathers to give Congress plenary powers over Indians, and it's categorically not true. In fact, there's one Supreme Court justice, believe it or not, who actually challenges whether the plenary powers doctrine even exists, and that happens to be Clarence Thomas. And I'm not saying it because he's a big fan or champion of Native issues, but there was a case called U.S. v. Lara where Billy Joe Lara was banned from his domestic partner's quote-unquote reservation because of he was an abuser. And he went there, violated the restraining order, struck a police officer, was charged served 90 days in jail, and then he was served up with federal charges for striking a federal officer because that was a BIA officer. And so it got into a big challenge over whether tribal police were vested with power from the federal government or from their own sovereignty. And in that case, Clarence Thomas questioned whether the plenary powers doctrine even exists. But that is one of the big challenges. And so I appreciate the call. I appreciate you bringing this up.
Yeah, for sure. And I listen to you regularly, and I'm glad you're bringing it up again because I try to write these down. I'm a student of like some of these, a lot of these things because, I've been given responsibility to continue the, efforts and challenges that we have with our free and independent existence. And I really like that you coined that terms, the free and independent.
I got to get
sovereign and all that other stuff.
I got to get that one to Stephen Newcomb because again, Stephen Newcomb's done so much of the work. Look, I want to thank you so much for the call. I'm going to try to get one more caller in real quick before we go. But that was a great call. It's great to hear from a Native brother, especially not somebody too local. So that was pretty good. All right, caller, you're up next. What's your name? Where you're calling from?
Peter from Glen Ridge, New Jersey.
Hey, Peter.
Hey, It's interesting hearing some of these terms. Another term that pops into my mind, we can sort it out some other time. Mercantilism, like before capitalism, I don't know. But I also do remember learning that the Dutch started the stock market, and it came because you could have people owning ships. They were all vulnerable. If one person owned one ship, he could be sunk. So they said, how about I own 10% of your ship, and you own 10% of my ship? And that's kind of, my understanding is that was the beginning, if not of capitalism, of the stock market was in, what you were talking about earlier, in Holland.
Well, and Charlie may be biased because of his Italian ancestry to claim that capitalism was started in Florence and capitalism was behind the stock market and all that other stuff. But he may be a little bit nationalistically biased, I guess. But who knows?
Yeah, and I really appreciate what you said about because you say the Second Amendment being necessary to the security of free people, the right to bear arms.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, it's like, when you look at it from a different angle, it's like, what is it to be being necessary for the security of the free people?
Yeah, and a well-regulated militia to protect against tyranny.
But if you look at it from a different angle, it's like, wait a minute. Most of the people were not going to be taking up arms against the Brits. It's going to be the Indians.
Well, but here's the thing, and again, if you go back to the Doctrine of Discovery, you realize that even in the papal bulls that came from the Catholic Church, they literally considered anybody who was a pagan to be the tyranny of enemies of Christ. So, I mean, it's kind of, so paganism was considered a tyranny all by itself. So, I mean, all of a sudden, when you start thinking about tyranny, it isn't just about an oppressive ruler. It is about anything that, that the establishment regards as something that they consider a threat or make a threat. So
so you're saying a threat to the church or the government?
Yep, that could be considered tyranny. So that's interesting, and I've never even made that jump until just now. So I'm glad you brought it up. All right, Peter, thank you for the call. We got to get going. I got to get out of here. We will be back next week, and maybe Shadi will be back with us next week, and we'll see what we come up with with a guest to join us for next week as well. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk, and I want to thank you guys for listening. Yahweh.
Talk to somebody, let them know. Talk to your friends, let your feelings show. Even if it feels like there's nobody, darling.